On the morning of September 21st, 2001, a 44-year-old Defense Intelligence Agency analyst named Ana Belén Montes arrived at her office in the Bolling Air Force Base complex in Washington, D.C., as she had done nearly every workday for the previous 16 years. 10 days earlier, terrorists had attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and the DIA, like every other American intelligence agency, was operating in crisis mode, working extended hours to assess threats and brief policymakers on what might come next. Montes was senior enough that she had been involved in some of those briefings, providing analysis on potential state sponsors of terrorism and the geopolitical implications of the attacks. What her colleagues did not know was that for those entire 16 years, Anna Montes had been working for Cuban intelligence, providing Havana with some of the most sensitive information the United States possessed about Cuba and American military capabilities. At approximately 9:30 that morning, FBI agents entered Montes's office, identified themselves, and placed her under arrest for espionage. She did not resist. She did not appear surprised. According to agents present, her expression was one of calm resignation, as if she had been expecting this moment for years and had made her peace with it. The arrest ended one of the most unusual espionage cases in American history, a case distinguished not by the amount of money involved or the number of executions it caused, but by the ideological conviction that drove it and the psychological complexity of the woman at its center. Ana Belén Montes was born in February 1957 on a U.S. military base in West Germany, the oldest of 4 children born to Alberto Montes, a U.S. Army doctor, and Emilia Montes, a homemaker. The family moved frequently during Anna's childhood, as military families do, living on bases in Germany, Kansas, and eventually settling in Towson, Maryland, outside Baltimore. To outsiders, the Montes family appeared successful and stable, a military family with professional parents and bright children. Inside the home, the reality was darker. Alberto Montes was, by multiple accounts, including those of his children, an abusive and controlling man, particularly toward his wife but also toward the children. The abuse was not always physical, though there were incidents of that as well, but more often psychological, a pattern of domination, criticism, and humiliation that created an atmosphere of fear and tension. Anna, as the oldest child, bore witness to her father's treatment of her mother and absorbed lessons about power, authority, and injustice that would shape her worldview in ways that would not become apparent for years. She was an excellent student, serious and intense, less interested in social activities than in academics and ideas. She graduated from Loch Raven High School in 1975 with grades strong enough to earn admission to the University of Virginia, where she majored in foreign affairs with a focus on Latin America. At Virginia, Montes began to develop the political consciousness that would eventually lead her to espionage. The late 1970s were a period of significant political awakening on American college campuses, particularly regarding U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. Students organized protests against American support for right-wing dictatorships in Chile, Argentina, and Central America. They raised awareness about human rights abuses committed by regimes that received American military aid, and they challenged the Cold War logic that justified supporting authoritarian governments simply because they were anti-communist. Ana Montes, who had grown up watching her father exercise arbitrary authority within their home, found these arguments compelling. She began to see American foreign policy, particularly toward Cuba and Central America, as a larger version of the abuse she had witnessed in her childhood, powerful entities using their strength to dominate weaker ones without moral justification. She graduated from the University of Virginia in 1979 and accepted a position with the Department of Justice in Washington, working in a clerical capacity that did not require a security clearance and did not involve classified information. The work was administrative and unfulfilling, but it provided income and allowed her to remain in Washington while she considered her next steps. In 1981, she enrolled in the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, known as SAIS, to pursue a master's degree in international relations with a focus on Latin American studies. It was at SAIS, during the early 1980s, that Ana Montes was recruited by Cuban intelligence. The exact circumstances of her recruitment remain partially classified, but declassified summaries and Montes's own later statements provide a general outline. She was approached, either directly or through an intermediary, by someone connected to Cuban intelligence who recognized in her the qualities that make an effective intelligence source: ideological sympathy with Cuba, opposition to American foreign policy, intellectual capability, and the potential for access to sensitive information. The approach was careful and gradual, beginning with conversations about politics and U.S.-Cuba relations, progressing to discussions about how someone opposed to American policy might take concrete action, and eventually arriving at a direct proposal that Montes work for Cuban intelligence. Unlike Robert Hanssen or Aldrich Ames, who were recruited through appeals to greed, Ana Montes was recruited through ideology. She was not offered money, at least not as the primary motivation. She was offered the opportunity to serve what she believed was a just cause, to help Cuba defend itself against American aggression, and to work toward a world where small nations could exist without being dominated by powerful ones. The recruitment narrative presented to her was one of moral righteousness, of standing with the oppressed against the oppressor, of using the tools of American power against itself in service of higher principles. Montes accepted. According to her later testimony, she believed that American policy toward Cuba was unjust, that the United States had no right to isolate and punish a small island nation simply because it had chosen a different political system, and that helping Cuba was not treason but rather a form of moral resistance. This framing would sustain her espionage for nearly 2 decades, allowing her to reconcile her betrayal of the United States with her self-image as a person of principle and integrity. The Cuban intelligence service, the Dirección de Inteligencia, known as DI, began training Montes in the tradecraft she would need to operate as a long-term penetration agent. Unlike Soviet or Russian intelligence, which often preferred to run sources through direct handler contact, the DI trained Montes to operate with minimal contact, using sophisticated communications methods that reduced the risk of detection. She was taught to use a shortwave radio to receive encrypted messages from Havana. She was trained in the use of code systems that would allow her to transcribe those messages and to encrypt her own reports. She was instructed in operational security protocols that would minimize the chance that her activities would be noticed by American counterintelligence. And critically, she was directed to seek employment with an American intelligence agency that would give her access to information about Cuba. The DI recognized that Montes was years away from being in a position to provide useful intelligence, but they were willing to invest in her as a long-term asset, guiding her career choices and waiting patiently for her to achieve access. This approach, cultivation of a source over years before they can provide significant intelligence, requires discipline and patience that distinguished Cuban intelligence operations from the more opportunistic approaches sometimes used by other services. In 1985, after completing her master's degree at SAIS, Ana Montes applied for a position with the Defense Intelligence Agency. The DIA, which operates under the Department of Defense, is responsible for providing military intelligence to policymakers, commanders, and other government agencies. Montes applied specifically for a position as an analyst focusing on Latin American affairs, a role that would give her access to classified information about American military activities, intelligence operations, and policy deliberations regarding Cuba and other countries in the region. she was hired. The DIA, impressed by her academic credentials, her language skills, and her apparent expertise in Latin American affairs, brought her on as a junior analyst in the Latin America division. She received a security clearance, underwent background investigations that found nothing suspicious, and began work in an office that gave her access to some of the most sensitive intelligence the United States possessed about Cuba. For the first few years of her career at the DIA, Montes worked on Central American issues, particularly El Salvador and Nicaragua, where civil wars were ongoing and American policy was deeply engaged. She produced competent analysis, received positive performance evaluations, and was regarded by colleagues as intelligent if somewhat reserved. In 1992, she transferred to the Cuban Affairs section, becoming one of a small number of analysts responsible for assessing Cuban military capabilities, political developments, and potential threats to American interests. By the mid-1990s, Anna Montes had become the Defense Intelligence Agency's senior analyst on Cuba, the person to whom policymakers and military commanders turned when they needed authoritative assessments of Cuban intentions and capabilities. She briefed officials at the Pentagon, the National Security Council, and the State Department. She wrote intelligence reports that were distributed throughout the intelligence community. She was consulted on policy decisions regarding Cuba, including decisions about military exercises, intelligence collection priorities, and diplomatic strategy. And all the while, she was providing Cuban intelligence with detailed information about what the United States knew, what the United States was planning, and what the United States believed about Cuba. The information Montes provided to Cuba over 16 years was extensive and damaging. She disclosed the identities of at least 4 American intelligence officers working on Cuba operations. She revealed details about American intelligence collection methods, including technical surveillance capabilities and human source networks. She provided information about U.S. military plans, including contingency plans for potential conflict with Cuba, and details about military exercises conducted in the region. She disclosed the contents of classified intelligence reports, allowing Cuba to understand not just what the United States knew, but how it knew it, what sources and methods were being used, and where American intelligence had gaps or weaknesses. Perhaps most significantly, Montes used her position to shape American understanding of Cuba in ways that served Cuban interests. As the senior DIA analyst on Cuba, her assessments carried enormous weight. When she wrote in intelligence reports that Cuba posed minimal military threat to the United States, policymakers believed her because she was the expert. When she assessed that Cuba was not engaged in activities that American intelligence suspected, her judgments influenced operational decisions about where to allocate resources. The ability to shape intelligence assessments from the inside, to influence what American policymakers believed about Cuba, was in some ways more valuable to Cuban intelligence than any specific document or piece of information she could provide. Montes's operational methods were sophisticated and disciplined. She did not meet with handlers in person, a practice that would have created opportunities for surveillance to detect her activities. Instead, she received instructions from Cuban intelligence through encrypted messages transmitted via shortwave radio. She owned a Toshiba laptop and a Sony shortwave radio, devices that would later be found in her apartment and analyzed by FBI forensics specialists. On designated evenings, she would tune the radio to specific frequencies and record broadcasts that sounded like random number sequences but were actually encrypted messages. She would then use a decryption program on her laptop to decode the messages, which provided her with instructions about what information to collect, how to transmit it, and when to expect her next communication. To send information to Cuban intelligence, Montes used a more complex system. She would type her reports on her laptop, encrypt them using a sophisticated code system, and then reduce the encrypted text to a format that could be transmitted via data burst on a pager. She would travel to locations with public payphones, dial a number that connected to a Cuban intelligence facility, and transmit the encrypted data. The entire transmission would take only seconds, far too brief for American signals intelligence to intercept and trace. After transmission, she would delete all files from her laptop, a security measure designed to ensure that even if the laptop were seized, there would be no recoverable evidence of her espionage. The discipline required to maintain this operational security for 16 years was extraordinary. Montes could not make mistakes, could not become careless, could not allow the stress of living a double life to affect her work performance or her personal behavior in ways that might attract attention. She remained single, maintaining romantic relationships that were apparently genuine but never developed into the kind of long-term commitment that might have created additional security risks. She lived modestly in an apartment in Washington, drove an aging car, and maintained a lifestyle entirely consistent with a government employee's salary. She did not travel to Cuba, did not maintain contact with known Cuban intelligence officers, and did not do anything that would provide American counterintelligence with obvious grounds for suspicion. The only money she received from Cuban intelligence, according to her later statements and FBI investigation, was reimbursement for expenses related to her espionage activities, payments for the radio, the laptop, and travel costs when she needed to use payphones in specific locations. Unlike Ames or Hanssen, who received millions of dollars, Montes was not paid a salary or given significant sums. Her motivation was ideological, not financial, and the absence of unexplained wealth was one reason she remained undetected for so long. But despite her discipline, despite the sophistication of her operational security, patterns emerged that eventually attracted attention. By the late 1990s, the DIA and FBI had begun to notice anomalies in their Cuba operations. Intelligence sources in Cuba were being compromised with regularity that suggested a penetration. Operations that should have been secret were apparently known to Cuban intelligence before they could be executed. And critically, Cuba seemed to possess detailed knowledge about American intelligence assessments, suggesting that someone with access to finished intelligence reports was providing information to Havana. The FBI opened an investigation, codenamed Cover-Up, to identify potential sources of the leaks. The investigation was methodical, involving the review of personnel files, financial records, and access logs for employees who had access to the compromised information. Ana Montes was among the potential suspects, but so were dozens of other DIA employees, CIA officers, and personnel from other agencies who worked on Cuba issues. What distinguished Montes from other suspects was not a single piece of evidence but an accumulation of small indicators. She had access to all of the compromised information. She had a history of expressing sympathy for Cuba in casual conversations with colleagues, comments that had been noted but not considered particularly significant. And critically, she had been observed by colleagues engaging in behavior that seemed odd, arriving at work early or staying late when she had no obvious work that required those hours, accessing classified computer systems at unusual times, and occasionally appearing tense or distracted in ways that were inconsistent with her normally controlled demeanor. In 2000, the FBI obtained authorization to conduct a more intensive investigation of Montes, including physical surveillance and monitoring of her communications. Investigators observed her purchasing a shortwave radio at an electronics store, a purchase that would mean nothing for most people but was significant for someone suspected of espionage. They noticed that she traveled periodically to locations with payphones, making brief calls and then leaving immediately. And most critically, they observed her accessing classified information that was outside her normal analytical responsibilities, downloading documents about intelligence operations that had no apparent connection to her work on Cuba policy assessments. The evidence was mounting, but it remained largely circumstantial. The FBI needed proof that Montes was actually engaged in espionage, not just exhibiting behavior that might be explained by other factors. Obtaining that proof required a more aggressive approach. In May 2001, the FBI conducted a covert search of Montes's apartment while she was at work. The search was executed with extreme care to ensure that nothing would alert Montes that her security had been compromised. FBI specialists entered the apartment, photographed everything in its original position, searched for evidence, and departed, leaving no trace of their presence. What they found confirmed their suspicions. The Toshiba laptop and Sony shortwave radio were discovered, along with diskettes containing encrypted files. The FBI copied the hard drive of the laptop and the contents of the diskettes, and forensic analysis revealed that the encryption system Montes was using was consistent with systems known to be used by Cuban intelligence. The FBI also found notes written in Montes's handwriting that appeared to be related to communications she had received, references to S and other designations that suggested intelligence tradecraft. With this evidence, the FBI had proof that Montes was engaged in espionage. But they faced a decision about when to make the arrest. Arresting her immediately would prevent any additional damage, but it would also limit the amount of information they could gather about how she operated, what she had provided to Cuba, and whether there were other Cuban intelligence sources within the American government. The FBI decided to continue surveillance, to monitor Montes's activities, and to plan for an arrest at a time when they could maximize the intelligence value of the case. That timeline accelerated dramatically on September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks on that day created a national security environment in which the FBI could not afford to take risks with known spies operating inside intelligence agencies. There was concern, though it proved unfounded, that Cuba might have had some connection to the attacks or that the attacks might create opportunities for hostile intelligence services to exploit American distraction. And critically, Montes's position at the DIA meant she was being briefed on sensitive counterterrorism information in the wake of the attacks, information that the FBI could not risk being transmitted to Cuba. On September 21, 2001, 10 days after the attacks, the FBI made the decision to arrest Ana Montes. The arrest was conducted at her office rather than her home to minimize the risk that she might destroy evidence or attempt to signal her Cuban handlers. When agents entered her office that morning, Montes was seated at her desk, working on an intelligence assessment. She was informed that she was under arrest for espionage. She did not deny the charges. According to FBI reports, she acknowledged almost immediately that she had been working for Cuba, though she declined to provide details without consulting an attorney. The search of Montes's apartment following her arrest yielded additional evidence. FBI investigators found the laptop and radio, diskettes with encrypted files, and documents that provided insight into her operational methods. Forensic analysis of the laptop revealed that Montes had been meticulous about deleting files after use, but specialists were able to recover fragments of encrypted communications and notes about information she had collected. The evidence was comprehensive enough to support multiple charges of espionage and conspiracy. Ana Montes was held without bail, deemed a flight risk and a continuing security threat. Her attorney, Plato Kakaris, who had previously represented Aldrich Ames, began negotiations for a plea agreement. The government's case was overwhelming, and a trial would almost certainly result in conviction on charges that could carry the death penalty or life imprisonment. But prosecutors were interested in a plea agreement because they wanted Montes to cooperate with a damage assessment, to provide information about what she had given to Cuba and how she had operated, information that would be difficult to obtain through trial. On March 19, 2002, Ana Montes pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage. In exchange for her guilty plea and cooperation with a damage assessment, prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, significantly less than the life sentence or death penalty that could have been imposed if she had been convicted at trial. Montes agreed to submit to extensive debriefings, to answer questions about her activities, and to provide information that would help the intelligence community understand the scope of the damage she had caused. The debriefings that followed revealed a woman who remained defiant and unrepentant despite facing decades in prison. Montes acknowledged that she had provided classified information to Cuba for 16 years. She confirmed that she had disclosed intelligence sources, operational methods, and policy information. But she refused to express regret for what she had done. Instead, she maintained that her actions had been morally justified, that American policy toward Cuba was unjust, and that helping Cuba defend itself against American aggression was an act of conscience rather than betrayal. This posture, moral certainty combined with complete absence of remorse, distinguished Montes from other spies who had expressed at least performative regret when confronted with the consequences of their actions. Montes did not claim that she had been motivated by money or coerced or misled. She stated clearly that she had chosen to work for Cuba because she believed it was the right thing to do, and that she would make the same choice again if given the opportunity. This ideological conviction, unwavering despite 16 years of betrayal and the destruction it caused, revealed something about the psychology of ideologically motivated espionage that made intelligence professionals and psychologists deeply uncomfortable. The damage assessment conducted by the DI, CIA, and FBI with Montes's cooperation revealed the full scope of her betrayal. She had compromised at least 4 intelligence officers working on Cuba operations, though their identities remained classified. She had disclosed details about American intelligence collection capabilities, including technical systems and human source networks, that allowed Cuba to identify and neutralize American intelligence operations. She had provided information about U.S. military capabilities and contingency plans that gave Cuba strategic advantages in understanding how the United States would respond to various scenarios. Perhaps most significantly, Montes had provided Cuba with advance warning about American military and intelligence activities that could have endangered American lives. During the 1990s, when American Special Operations Forces conducted operations in Central America, some of which involved cooperation with Cuban exile groups, Montes provided information about those operations to Cuban intelligence. While there is no confirmed case of American military personnel being killed or captured as a direct result of Montes's betrayal, the potential for such outcomes was significant, and senior military officials testified that her actions had put lives at risk. On October 16, 2002, Ana Montes was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. At her sentencing hearing, she was given the opportunity to address the court. What she said reflected the same ideological conviction that had sustained her espionage for 16 years. She stated that she believed her actions had been justified, that American policy toward Cuba was cruel and unjust, and that she had done what she believed was right. She did not apologize to the intelligence officers she had compromised, to the military personnel she had endangered, or to her colleagues at the DIA who had trusted her. The judge, noting her lack of remorse and the severity of her crimes, imposed the sentence prosecutors had recommended, 25 years, and Montes was transferred to the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, a federal prison for female inmates. The impact of Montes's arrest on her family was profound and complicated. Her siblings, Lucy, Tito, and Maria, had not known about her espionage. They learned about it the same way the public did, through news reports following her arrest. The family, which had already been marked by their father's abuse and the dysfunction it created, was now additionally burdened with being the family of one of the most notorious spies in American history. Lucy Montes, Anna's younger sister, who worked as an FBI agent, was placed on administrative leave during the investigation to ensure that there was no appearance of conflict or potential compromise. She was eventually cleared and returned to work, but the professional and personal toll of having a sibling convicted of espionage was immense. The Montes siblings have given limited public statements about Ana, but those they have given reflect anger, betrayal, and confusion. They describe a woman who was brilliant, principled, and deeply concerned with justice, but whose moral framework had become so distorted that she could justify 16 years of betrayal. They struggled to reconcile the sister they knew, who had protected them from their father's abuse, who had been a role model and a source of strength, with the woman who had systematically compromised American intelligence operations and shown no remorse for doing so. Ana Montes's colleagues at the DIA experienced their own forms of trauma. Many had worked with her for years, had trusted her professional judgment, had relied on her assessments when briefing senior officials. Learning that she had been working for Cuba the entire time created not just professional embarrassment but a sense of personal betrayal. Some questioned their own judgment, wondered how they had failed to detect signs of her espionage. Others felt anger at having been manipulated, at having been used as unwitting participants in Montes's deception. The case prompted extensive internal reviews at the DIA, reforms to security procedures, and a cultural shift toward greater skepticism and internal monitoring that some employees felt undermined the collaborative environment necessary for effective intelligence work. The question of why Ana Montes committed espionage, what drove her to betray the United States for 16 years, is more complex than the questions posed by Ames or Hanssen. Greed is a straightforward motivation, easily understood if not easily excused. But ideology, the belief that one is serving a higher moral purpose, creates a different psychological dynamic. Montes genuinely believed that helping Cuba was morally justified, that American policy was unjust, and that her espionage was a form of resistance against oppression. This belief system was rooted in experiences that predated her recruitment. Her father's abuse had taught her about the abuse of power, about how authority figures could use their positions to dominate and harm those weaker than themselves. Her education had exposed her to critiques of American foreign policy that resonated with those early lessons. And her recruitment by Cuban intelligence had provided her with a framework for translating those beliefs into action, for moving from passive opposition to active resistance. But understanding the psychological origins of Montes's ideology does not make her actions less damaging or more forgivable. The intelligence officers she compromised did not deserve to have their identities disclosed because Montes disagreed with American policy. The military personnel she endangered did not forfeit their right to safety because she believed Cuba was being treated unjustly. And the American public, which relies on intelligence agencies to provide accurate information about potential threats, had a right to expect that senior analysts were not secretly working for foreign governments while shaping intelligence assessments. The moral framework Montes constructed to justify her espionage is disturbing precisely because it demonstrates how intelligent, principled people can rationalize profound betrayal. She did not see herself as a traitor but as a person of conscience. She did not see the information she provided to Cuba as damaging to American interests but as helping a small nation defend itself against a superpower. And she did not see the people she betrayed as victims but as participants in a system she believed was fundamentally unjust. This capacity for moral rationalization, for constructing a framework in which betrayal becomes righteousness, is what makes ideologically motivated espionage particularly dangerous and particularly difficult to detect. Montes passed polygraph examinations during her career, likely because she genuinely believed she was doing the right thing and did not experience the kind of stress or guilt that polygraphs are designed to detect. She maintained her cover for 16 years because she saw her espionage not as a shameful secret but as a justified activity that required discretion. During her imprisonment at FMC Carswell, Montes maintained her ideological convictions. According to limited reports from those who had contact with her, she remained defiant, continued to believe that her actions had been justified, and expressed no regret for the damage she had caused. She reportedly spent her time reading, particularly about Latin American politics and history, and maintained correspondence with supporters who shared her political views. She also apparently reflected on her life and choices, though what conclusions she reached remained private. On January 6, 2023, after serving just over 21 years of her 25-year sentence, Anna Montes was released from federal prison. She was 65 years old. The release came slightly early due to good behavior credits and changes to federal sentencing guidelines. She was placed on supervised probation for 5 years, with conditions that included restrictions on her travel, monitoring of her communications, and prohibitions on contact with Cuban officials or intelligence personnel. News of her release received limited media coverage, a brief mention in news reports rather than the major event her arrest had been. Montes gave no interviews, made no public statements, and reportedly moved to Puerto Rico to live near family. The conditions of her probation prevented her from speaking publicly about her espionage or her beliefs regarding Cuba, though whether she would have chosen to do so remained unclear. The legacy of Ana Montes's espionage extends beyond the specific operation she compromised or the specific intelligence she provided to Cuba. Her case demonstrated that ideological motivation could sustain espionage just as effectively as financial motivation. Perhaps more effectively because ideological spies often lived more modestly and aroused less suspicion. It revealed vulnerabilities in the security clearance and monitoring systems that were designed to detect financial problems or unexplained wealth, but were less effective at identifying individuals whose betrayal was rooted in political conviction rather than greed. The Montes case also raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of loyalty and the relationship between personal conscience and institutional obligation. In a democratic society, individuals have the right to disagree with government policy, to express opposition, and to work through legal channels to change policies they believe are unjust. But Montes had moved beyond legal opposition to active betrayal, providing classified information to a foreign government while working in a position of trust within the American intelligence community. The question of where the line between legitimate dissent and treasonous betrayal lies is not always clear, but Montes had crossed it so completely that her case became a textbook example of what constitutes espionage. For the intelligence community, the Montes case prompted reforms similar to those implemented after Ames and Hanssen. Security clearance reviews were strengthened to include more rigorous assessments of political views and ideological commitments. Polygraph examinations were modified to include questions designed to detect ideologically motivated betrayal. Access controls were enhanced to limit the number of people who could access broad categories of information, reducing the potential damage any single penetration could cause. And perhaps most significantly, the culture within intelligence agencies shifted toward greater internal monitoring and a recognition that threats could come not just from greedy employees, but from ideologically committed ones who genuinely believed they were serving a higher purpose. The question of what Ana Montes's story means, beyond the specific details of her crimes and their consequences, is one that continues to generate debate. At one level, it is a case study in the dangers of ideological certainty, a demonstration of how the belief that one is morally superior can justify actions that cause genuine harm to others. At another level, it raises questions about how intelligence agencies should assess and monitor employees whose political views may be at odds with the policies they are tasked with implementing. There is also the question of proportionality in Montes's case. Unlike Ames and Hanssen, whose betrayals led directly to executions, Montes's espionage did not result in confirmed deaths, though it certainly endangered lives and compromised operations. Does this make her crimes less severe? Intelligence professionals and legal scholars disagree. Some argue that the absence of confirmed deaths suggests that Montes's damage, while significant, was not catastrophic. Others argue that endangering lives is no less serious than causing deaths, that the moral calculus of espionage does not depend on whether potential harms were realized, and that Montes's 16 years of sustained betrayal represent one of the longest and most damaging penetrations in American intelligence history. The families and colleagues affected by Montes's espionage carry consequences that are less visible but no less real than those in cases involving executions. The intelligence officers she compromised had their careers disrupted, their safety endangered, and their ability to conduct operations permanently compromised. The DIA analysts who worked with her experienced a profound breach of trust that affected their professional lives and their personal sense of security. And Montes's own family bore the burden of her choices, living with the knowledge that someone they loved had committed acts of betrayal that most Americans view as among the most serious crimes possible. Ana Montes was 28 years old when she was recruited by Cuban intelligence in the early 1980s. She was 44 when she was arrested on September 21, 2001. She was 65 when she was released from federal prison in January 2023. And throughout those decades, through recruitment, through 16 years of active espionage, through arrest and imprisonment and release, she apparently never wavered in her belief that what she had done was morally justified. There is no redemption in this story, no moment of recognition that might transform betrayal into something more comprehensible. There is only the persistence of conviction, the unwavering certainty that can drive someone to betray their country for 16 years and to feel no remorse even when confronted with the consequences. And in the end, perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of the Ana Montes case. Not that someone was willing to commit espionage for ideological reasons, but that the ideology was strong enough to sustain betrayal across decades, through arrest, through imprisonment, and apparently through to release. It demonstrates that moral certainty, when detached from consideration of the harm one's actions cause to others, can be as dangerous as greed or ego, perhaps more dangerous because it requires no external validation and no material reward. It simply requires the belief, sincere or self-deceiving, that one is serving justice, and that belief, once established, can justify almost anything.